The morning was crisp and clear at the regional airport. Emma Mitchell's small hand clutched her mother as they navigated through the bustling terminal. The smell of fresh coffee and jet fuel mingled in the air, and the low hum of luggage trolleys created a peculiar rhythm. Emma's eyes darted everywhere. She loved airports, the chaos, the excitement, the feeling that something extraordinary was always about to happen. At 11 years old, she had already memorized countless aircraft manuals and simulator controls, quietly fascinated by how metal birds soared effortlessly in the sky. Today, however, was different. Today she was actually flying, not just imagining it. As they approached Gate 12, the passengers boarded Flight 482. The plane was a gleaming marvel, a mid-sized commercial aircraft designed for comfort and efficiency. Its wings stretched like giant arms ready to embrace the skies. Emma's father, David, a commercial airline pilot himself, walked beside her with a mixture of pride and concern. "Remember, pay attention to everything," he said softly. "The controls, the instruments, the subtle movements. One day, maybe you'll understand." Emma's eyes sparkled. She didn't just understand, she loved it. He had introduced her to flight simulators years ago, letting her explore emergency procedures and cockpit systems. Now, she was finally on a real aircraft, at cruising altitude, ready to witness the true magic of aviation firsthand. The cabin hummed with activity. Flight attendants greeted passengers with smiles, pushing carts filled with beverages and snacks, their footsteps echoing in the narrow aisles. Emma sat in her window seat, pressed against the glass, tracing the clouds with her finger. "Do you see that?" she asked her mother, pointing at a cluster of fluffy white clouds floating far below. Her mother chuckled softly. "Yes, sweetheart, it's beautiful." But Emma wasn't listening to her mother. Her mind was calculating. She was thinking about how lift and thrust worked together, about how the wings supported the plane, about how small adjustments could make a massive difference at high speeds. The intercom buzzed, and the captain's voice, calm and steady, filled the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome aboard Flight 482 nonstop to Chicago. We expect clear skies for most of the journey. Please ensure your seatbelts are fastened and enjoy your flight." Emma's father smiled, and her mother adjusted her daughter's seatbelt. Everything felt routine, mundane even, but Emma's excitement bubbled beneath the surface. This was her element, even if most passengers saw it as just another flight. The plane began taxiing down the runway, engines roaring with restrained power. Emma felt the vibration through her fingertips as she rested her hands on the armrest, imagining herself controlling the throttles, coordinating the flaps, adjusting the yoke. The plane lifted gracefully into the air, the ground dropping away beneath them. Below, the patchwork of farms and roads spread out like a living map. The hum of conversation mixed with the soft whir of ventilation. Some passengers were reading newspapers or watching in-flight screens. Emma, however, was entirely absorbed in the mechanics of flight. Her father leaned over, whispering, "See the horizon. Notice how we're adjusting our climb angle slightly." That called a rate of climb. A pilot controls that carefully to avoid sudden stress on the aircraft. Emma nodded, her mind absorbing every word. She was meticulous in her observation, noting every dial, every indicator, every subtle sound of the engines. To her, this wasn't just flying. It was a symphony of physics and precision. She could almost feel the airflow over the wings, the pressure differential, the invisible forces that kept the plane suspended above the earth. Suddenly, a flicker of movement in the cockpit caught Emma's attention. The captain and first officer were performing their routine checks, pressing buttons, scanning instruments. Emma leaned forward, fascinated, though her mother gently tapped her shoulder, cautioning her to stay seated. Emma obeyed, but her mind raced. She had memorized every button engaged during her countless hours with flight simulators at home. She understood their purpose, their function, even the critical ones that could prevent a disaster. Today, she thought, "I'm seeing it for real." The flight reached cruising altitude, and the cabin lights dimmed slightly as attendants passed through, offering drinks and snacks. Emma's father sipped his coffee, eyes constantly flicking toward the cockpit. He had a sense of pride seeing his daughter so engaged, but also a shadow of unease. It wasn't fear of danger. He trusted the crew, but he knew that sometimes unexpected events could turn the routine into chaos. Emma's mother, meanwhile, smiled at her daughter's fascination, brushing back a lock of hair from her forehead. "You're going to be a pilot someday," she said softly, half joking, half serious. Emma's eyes glimmered. She knew it wasn't just a dream, it was inevitable. Outside the windows, clouds drifted lazily by, sunlight glinting on the plane's fuselage. Emma watched, mesmerized by their shape, by how the light played across the wings. But amid the calm, a subtle vibration ran through the cabin, almost imperceptible. Passengers didn't notice, but David did. He frowned slightly, scanning the instruments when the autopilot hummed softly in the background. Everything appeared normal, but sometimes, he reflected, the most dangerous moments come when everything seems fine. He mentally ran through emergency procedures, a habit instilled from years of training. He had taught Emma the same routines, hopping she'd never need them, but always preparing. Emma's thoughts drifted to the mechanics again. She imagined herself in the captain's seat, handling the yoke with confidence, issuing instructions, guiding the plane safely. She imagined reading the radar, adjusting for wind and turbulence, calculating descent paths. Every detail fascinated her. She didn't just want to fly, she wanted to understand everything about it. Her love for aviation wasn't whimsical. It was obsessive, precise, technical. She could name every button, every switch, and explain its purpose with clarity that amazed even her father. A slight bump shook the plane, catching passengers off guard. "Turbulence," the captain's calm voice announced over the intercom. Passengers gripped armrests, drinks sloshed in cups. Emma's excitement sharpened into curiosity. She noted how the plane tilted slightly, how the wings flexed, how the engines compensated for sudden changes in airflow. She could see the entire system at work, perfectly designed yet vulnerable. It was beautiful and terrifying simultaneously. Her father squeezed her shoulder lightly, whispering, "Pay attention. This is what separates good pilots from great ones." Emma nodded, eyes wide, absorbing every nuance. As Flight 482 continued its journey, Emma felt a mixture of exhilaration and anticipation. She didn't know it yet, but this calm, sunny flight would soon become the most extraordinary and dangerous day of her young life. Every glance at the cockpit, every hum of the engines, every instruction from the crew was quietly setting the stage for an event that would test courage, skill, and composure beyond anything she had ever imagined. The clouds outside were serene, but the air above would soon erupt into chaos. Emma's adventure was just beginning. The hum of Flight 482's engines was suddenly interrupted by a subtle, almost imperceptible shudder. Most passengers didn't notice, lost in their movies, magazines, or quiet conversation. But Emma's father, David, had spent decades reading the subtle language of aircraft. His brow furrowed. Something was wrong. Then, almost simultaneously, the captain and first officer shifted in their seats, gripping their heads as if overcome by sudden dizziness. Oxygen masks hadn't even deployed yet, but David's instincts screamed that this was no ordinary turbulence. Within seconds, both pilots slumped forward. The yokes twitched as the autopilot disengaged, sending the plane into a subtle but alarming tilt. Passengers gasped, clinging to their seats. The hum of the engines became a roar, echoing through the fuselage. The flight attendants sprang into action, rushing toward the cockpit, shouting, shaking the pilots. "They're unresponsive. They're not waking up," one yelled, panic creeping into her voice. A man nearby pressed his call button frantically. Emma's mother gripped her daughter's hand tightly, eyes wide with fear. Emma's mind, however, went immediately to action, not panic. David leapt forward into the cockpit, shaking the pilots. "Can you hear me? Respond," he shouted. His training kicked in, adrenaline surging through his veins. He tried to access the autopilot to stabilize the plane, but both pilots had inadvertently disengaged it, leaving the aircraft vulnerable. The plane lurched, rolling slightly to the right. Passengers screamed, some grabbing whatever they could to brace themselves. Drinks flew across the aisle, hitting ceilings and seats. Emma's small hands gripped her mother's tightly, but a strange calm settled over her mind. She knew what had to be done. "Emma," David whispered, glancing at his daughter. His voice trembled, not from fear but from disbelief. "I need your help. I've trained you for this. Do you remember what to do?" Emma's blue eyes widened for a fraction of a second before hardening with resolve. "Yes," she said quietly, almost to herself. She had memorized every emergency procedure, every cockpit instrument, every step in a simulator hundreds of times. Now she would put that knowledge into action at 35,000 feet, with real lives depending on her. Flight attendants tried to calm passengers as the plane rocked in unexpected gusts. Some screamed in terror. "Brace yourselves," shouted one, guiding frightened passengers to proper positions. Outside the windows, clouds streaked past in chaotic patterns, illuminated occasionally by the sun's rays. The plane trembled, yawing slightly as if testing the limits of control. David turned to Emma, guiding her hands toward the cockpit controls. "You can do this," he murmured. "Follow my instructions, exactly as we practiced. I'll be here with you, but you have to take control." Emma's small hands hovered over the yoke, instinct taking over. She adjusted the throttle slightly, watching the instruments flicker. Altitude, airspeed, heading, all had to be maintained with precision. She could hear the radio static as air traffic control tried to make sense of the emergency unfolding at 35,000 feet. "Flight 482, identify yourself. Repeat, identify yourself." The voice was panicked but calm, trying to guide the plane safely. Emma's father repeated the instructions slowly, letting her copy every movement. Her hands were steady, despite the chaos, as if the plane itself recognized her resolve. Passengers clung to their seats, praying, whispering, holding their children tightly. Some stared at the cockpit doors, peering through the glass, unsure of what to expect. The young girl inside, barely more than a child, was now the most important pilot in the sky. Emma remembered every emergency procedure she had studied, checking instruments, engaging flaps, adjusting trim, monitoring airspeed. She repeated each instruction aloud, her voice surprisingly calm amid screaming and crying. Her father guided her hands, but every adjustment she made was precise, calculated, informed by hours of preparation that now became a lifeline. The turbulence increased, violent gusts tossing the plane slightly from side to side. Emma's heart pounded, but fear was overridden by focus. The plane tilted dangerously, but she corrected the roll with careful, measured movements. "Good, good," David encouraged quietly. "Maintain heading 270, descend gradually to 30,000 feet." She repeated the commands, checking each instrument, adjusting throttle and trim. Every flick of a dial mattered. Outside, the clouds thickened, lightning flashing in the distance, reflecting on the wings. Below, nothing but farmland stretched endlessly. Up here, every second was critical. The oxygen masks descended briefly from the ceiling in a few rows, adding to the chaos. Passengers strapped them on, some gasping. One child cried, calling for his mother. Flight attendants tried to reassure everyone, but their fear was palpable. Emma didn't flinch. Her hands moved over the controls, her small fingers pressing buttons, turning knobs, adjusting flaps. She was fully aware of the stakes. Every motion counted. She had to stabilize the aircraft before it descended uncontrollably or encountered more dangerous turbulence. She had to act quickly, precisely, fearlessly. David guided her through the procedures, whispering instructions under the roar of engines and the hum of the emergency systems. "Check the fuel tanks, adjust the throttles, monitor your speed, keep us level," he urged. Emma nodded, absorbing each word, translating it into action. She watched the artificial horizon, scanning the altimeter, airspeed indicator, vertical speed indicator. The plane responded to her commands, wobbling slightly but correcting itself as her hands moved nimbly. Outside, clouds swirled. Inside, a strange calm descended over the cockpit, as if her confidence radiated outward, steadying the aircraft. Minutes stretched like hours. Passengers whispered nervously, some holding hands, others closing their eyes. Emma's mother stayed beside her, offering quiet encouragement. "You're doing so well," she said softly. Emma's jaw set. She repeated the instructions aloud, checked instruments, and monitored the plane's response. Every gust, every roll, every sudden movement of the wings was met with calculated corrections. It was surreal, an 11-year-old girl piloting a commercial jet while the adults around her either fainted or panicked. Yet in that moment, she was calm, precise, and in control, as if destiny had chosen her for this very trial. As the plane leveled at 30,000 feet, David allowed himself a brief glance around the cabin. Passengers were still frightened, but the panic had begun to subside. Emma's hands never wavered. She adjusted throttle, trimmed for stability, and maintained heading, following every instruction given by air traffic control. Her father's eyes shone with pride and disbelief. "Keep going, Emma. You're doing it," he whispered. Her mother's hand pressed against her back, steadying her. But it was Emma's skill, knowledge, and courage that kept Flight 482 in the air, high above clouds that had suddenly turned from serene to menacing. The realization hit Emma. She was controlling a plane full of lives. The gravity of the situation could have crushed anyone else, but she remained focused. Every adjustment mattered, every second counted, and she would not fail, not now, not ever. The cockpit door loomed like a portal to the unknown as David gently guided Emma toward it. Her small hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from anticipation. All her life, she had studied planes, buttons, and simulators, but nothing had prepared her for this. The real controls of a commercial jet, at 35,000 feet, with hundreds of lives depending on her. The roar of the engines vibrated through the floor, mingling with the frantic murmurs of flight attendants and the occasional passenger scream. Emma's heart pounded, but her mind sharpened to a razor's edge. David held her steady. "Emma, I know this is overwhelming, but you know more than most pilots at your age. Just follow my instructions and stay calm. You've trained for this." He had memorized every procedure, every potential emergency, but seeing his daughter in the cockpit, small, determined, capable, was both terrifying and awe-inspiring. Emma nodded, inhaling deeply, memorizing every flicker of light, every dial, every gauge. Her hands hovered over the controls like a pianist ready to play the most important piece of her life. The autopilot had failed and the aircraft lurched slightly. Emma quickly scanned the instruments: altimeter, airspeed indicator, heading, artificial horizon. She recognized them all from simulators, but in simulators, mistakes didn't risk hundreds of lives. Now each decision she made could mean survival or disaster. Her father's voice cut through the noise, calm yet firm. "Throttle at 35%. Keep the nose level. Repeat my instructions exactly." Emma mirrored his movements, adjusting the throttle with precision. The plane steadied slightly, a fragile sense of control returning to the cabin. Outside, clouds streaked past in chaotic formations, sunlight glinting on the wings. The plane rocked gently, then violently as gusts of wind assaulted it. Passengers gripped armrests, their faces pale with fear. Emma focused, blocking out the chaos. She had to think clearly. One misstep could send the plane into an uncontrolled dive. Her father guided her hands over the yoke, showing her subtle movements to maintain stability. "Don't overcorrect," he whispered. "Small, precise adjustments. Watch the instruments, not the clouds." She nodded, repeating every motion with meticulous care. Air traffic control crackled through the radio. "Flight 482, identify yourself. Repeat, identify yourself." Emma repeated the message as her father instructed. Controllers were confused, unsure whether the voice on the radio belonged to an adult or a child. Emma's tone was calm, professional, and surprisingly confident. She relayed the aircraft's altitude, heading, and situation. Instructions came back quickly. Maintain current heading, descend gradually to 30,000 feet, monitor airspeed. She repeated each instruction aloud, then adjusted the yoke, throttle, and trim accordingly. Every movement was deliberate, precise, and practiced. The turbulence increased, the plane bucking and rolling as if testing her resolve. Sweat beaded her forehead, but her hands stayed steady. David whispered, "Keep the plane level, adjust the rudder gently, use the trim." Emma followed exactly, scanning instruments, calculating movements. The plane responded, wobbling slightly, then correcting itself. Outside, lightning flashed in distant clouds. Inside, panic and awe battled in passengers' eyes. Few could comprehend that an 11-year-old girl was now piloting a commercial jet with the precision of a trained pilot. Emma's focus transformed fear into determination. Passengers murmured nervously. A woman whispered to her husband, "Is she really flying it?" He shook his head, eyes wide. Flight attendants moved silently through the cabin, bracing themselves as the plane continued to tilt slightly in response to wind gusts. Drinks sloshed in cups, trays rattled on trolleys. Emma's mother pressed a hand to her daughter's shoulder, whispering encouragement. "You're amazing, Emma. You can do this." Emma nodded but didn't speak. Her mind was completely immersed in the instruments, the yoke, the throttle, and the delicate balance of physics keeping the plane aloft. David guided her further, introducing the next steps, adjusting flaps, monitoring vertical speed, preparing for controlled descent if necessary. Emma memorized every dial, every lever, every digital readout. The cabin shuddered as a sudden gust of wind hit the plane from the side. Emma's small fingers moved instinctively, correcting the tilt, keeping the nose level. She realized she had entered a state where fear no longer existed, only action, only calculation, only precision. The plane responded to her movements, stabilizing. For the first time since the pilots collapsed, the cabin regained a sense of cautious hope. Minutes stretched into eternity as Emma maintained focus. Each command from air traffic control brought a new challenge. Adjust heading, reduce altitude, check fuel levels, monitor airspeed. She responded flawlessly, repeating every step aloud, her voice unwavering. Outside, clouds swirled, lightning streaking occasionally, but inside the cockpit, a quiet rhythm emerged. Emma and her father worked as one, guiding Flight 482 through the turbulence, navigating the delicate balance between danger and stability. Passengers slowly noticed the plane's steadiness, whispers of astonishment and tentative relief spreading through the cabin. Emma's small hands ached, but she ignored it. Her eyes scanned every gauge, every readout, every dial. She applied corrections gently, precisely. David's heart swelled with pride, but he also feared the enormity of the situation. One mistake, one miscalculation, could undo everything. Yet Emma's calm determination seemed to radiate outward, steadying not only the plane but the spirits of everyone aboard. Flight attendants exchanged stunned glances, realizing that the most competent pilot in the sky at that moment was a child. Time slowed as Emma guided the plane through the cloud layer. The roar of engines, the flickering lights, and the trembling fuselage became part of a symphony she could control. She repeated every command, monitored instruments, adjusted the yoke, managed throttle, and trimmed meticulously. Outside, the world remained chaotic. Inside, she had created order from disorder. The plane responded to her every movement. For passengers, the crisis was still frightening. For Emma, it was a test of skill, courage, and resolve she never thought she'd face in her lifetime. Hours, or what felt like hours, of tense coordination passed. Emma had become a pilot in every sense, performing at a level far beyond her years. Her father's voice was steady, guiding her when necessary, but he realized she had the skill, the focus, and the heart to manage this alone. The plane had stabilized. The instruments read steady, the engines hummed smoothly, and Flight 482 glided through the sky like a vessel guided by invisible hands. And yet the journey was far from over. Emma knew that the next challenge, landing the plane, would require even more precision, courage, and composure. But for now, as the turbulence eased and the plane maintained altitude and heading, a quiet confidence settled over her. She had stepped into the cockpit, confronted fear, and taken control when the world demanded it most. The passengers would soon witness a miracle, guided by the unlikeliest of pilots, an 11-year-old girl who refused to let panic rule the skis. Emma's eyes never left the instruments. The artificial horizon glowed softly in the cockpit, guiding her through the chaotic sky. Outside, the clouds twisted and churned, a turbulent barrier between her and the ground. Lightning flashed far in the distance, illuminating the wings, reminding her that time and precision were critical. The roar of the engines filled her ears, but inside, her mind was calm, focused, methodical. Every dial, every lever, every flicker of light mattered. Emma had one job: follow the instructions exactly and keep Flight 482 alive. Air traffic control crackled over the radio, their voices tense but steady. Flight 482, this is Chicago approach. We have your situation. Maintain heading 270. Descend to 30,000 feet. Monitor airspeed. Prepare for controlled descent toward our airport. Emma repeated each instruction aloud, her small voice steady, confident. David guided her hands to the yoke and throttle, whispering additional guidance, but Emma's mind was fully engaged. She adjusted the throttle precisely, lowered the nose slightly to initiate the descent, and kept the plane level with careful corrections. The autopilot was off, every motion manual, every adjustment critical. Passengers murmured anxiously. Some whispered prayers, others held children tightly, glancing at the cockpit, peering through the small windows with disbelief. "Is she really flying it?" one woman asked, voice shaking. A flight attendant, gripping a railing, whispered under her breath, "I can't believe it. She's keeping it steady." Emma's mother sat beside her, holding her daughter's hand and whispering encouragement. "You're doing amazing, Emma. Keep following instructions. You can do this." Emma nodded, absorbing every word, translating it into action. Her focus was absolute. Outside, turbulence rocked the plane, but she maintained control. David guided her through the next critical steps. "Flaps 30 for descent," he instructed. "Maintain heading. Watch the airspeed. Keep the nose steady." Emma carefully extended the flaps, feeling the plane respond immediately. It shuddered slightly but stabilized, her small hands adjusting trim to maintain balance. The engines roared as she modulated the throttle, compensating for wind gusts. Every movement was calculated, every action precise. She had imagined these scenarios countless times on her simulator, but now the stakes were real, far beyond anything she had ever faced. The lives of hundreds were in her hands. Descent was tense. Clouds thickened, the sky darkened, and the turbulence worsened. Lightning illuminated the horizon sporadically, showing glimpses of farmland and rivers far below. Air traffic control continued to provide instructions, guiding her every step. Flight 482, reduce speed to 280 knots. Descend 1,500 feet per minute. Prepare for landing sequence. Confirm gear and flaps. Emma repeated each command, her voice calm and unwavering. She monitored airspeed, adjusted throttle, and corrected pitch and roll with precise, small movements. Each flick of her fingers mattered. Each decision could be the difference between safety and disaster. The cabin rattled with every gust. Passengers gripped armrests, their faces pale with fear. Flight attendants moved quickly through the aisles, offering reassurances, instructing people to brace. Emma's mother whispered quietly, "You're incredible, Emma, just keep going." Emma's jaw set. She didn't speak. Words were unnecessary. She was focused entirely on the controls, the instruments, and the delicate balance of forces keeping Flight 482 airborne. Outside, the storm intensified, wind gusts pushing against the plane, testing her resolve. David guided her through the process of adjusting heading and altitude. "Turn gently, adjust trim, watch the vertical speed indicator, don't overcorrect." Emma complied, repeating each adjustment carefully, methodically. The plane swayed but regained stability with each correction. The passengers began to sense the difference. The rocking still occurred, but the fear began to give way to awe. Everyone realized that the young girl in the cockpit was not only managing the situation, she was excelling at it. Her calm determination radiated through the cabin. Emma prepared for the next critical step, monitoring the fuel gauges and managing engine output. "Switch tanks if needed," David instructed. "Keep an eye on the engines, make sure airspeed remains stable." Emma scanned the dials, noticing a slight imbalance. With precise adjustments to the throttles, she compensated, preventing any loss of power. Each adjustment required focus, speed, and accuracy. Outside, the storm remained unforgiving, but Emma's movements kept the plane level. She had become completely attuned to the aircraft, reacting instinctively, balancing manual control with learned procedures. Controllers guided her closer to the airport, giving instructions on descent, heading, and altitude. Flight 482, you are clear to descend further. Align with runway 27, prepare for final approach. Emma repeated the commands aloud and adjusted heading carefully. The plane tilted slightly, corrected immediately by her precise hands. The artificial horizon was her guide. The yoke obeyed her movements as if it recognized her determination. David whispered, "Keep it steady." Flaps down, gear ready. Emma followed every step, monitoring airspeed, altitude, and instruments, maintaining absolute focus amid the growing storm. The plane began its gradual descent. Passengers murmured, some praying, some holding hands. A few peeked at the cockpit, wide-eyed, trying to comprehend what they were witnessing. A child whispered to his mother, "Is that a real pilot?" His mother could only shake her head in disbelief. The turbulence continued, yet the plane responded perfectly to Emma's every move. Her small hands guided it with precision beyond her years. Every flick of the yoke, every adjustment to the throttle, every check of the instruments was executed flawlessly. She was calm, methodical, and in total control. As the distance to the airport decreased, air traffic control continued to issue precise instructions. Descend to 10,000 feet, reduce speed to 250 knots, maintain heading 270, confirm gear and flaps. Emma repeated each instruction and executed it. The plane responded immediately. The runway lights, distant but visible, began to pierce the cloud layer. Outside, lightning flickered, illuminating the landscape below. Inside, a tense calm settled in the cabin. Emma's hands remained firm on the yoke, eyes scanning instruments, making small, exact adjustments. Every movement was deliberate, every action critical. Flight 482 was finally under control, thanks to an 11-year-old girl who refused to fail. The distant runway lights flickered through a thick curtain of clouds, but Flight 482 was far from safe. Emma's hands remained steady on the yoke, eyes locked on the instruments. Airspeed fluctuated slightly as gusts of wind battered the plane, and she instinctively adjusted throttle and trim. The autopilot remained offline, leaving every adjustment to her small hands. David's voice whispered beside her, "Watch your engines, fuel levels, speed, flaps, every detail matters." Emma nodded, absorbing every word, translating it into action with a calmness that belied her age. Suddenly, the fuel gauge flickered, indicating an imbalance. David's heart raced. "Switch tanks, adjust throttle carefully," he instructed. Emma's fingers moved nimbly over the controls, toggling the fuel tanks and checking engine performance. The engines shuddered, then steadied, responding to her adjustments. Outside, the storm intensified, lightning flashing across the sky, illuminating the plane's wings. Turbulence rocked the cabin violently, but Emma corrected with precise, measured movements. The passengers braced, white-knuckled, as their lives now depended on a child's ability to manage technical systems that seasoned pilots mastered with years of experience. Flight attendants moved quickly through the aisles, reassuring passengers as best they could. Some whispered prayers, others gripped seatbacks tightly. Emma's mother pressed a hand to her daughter's shoulder. "You're incredible," she said softly. Emma didn't respond. Her mind was fully immersed in the cockpit, monitoring altitude, airspeed, heading, and engine output. The plane shuddered as a gust hit the left wing, forcing her to compensate with subtle adjustments to the yoke and rudder. Each flick of her fingers was deliberate, precise, and life-saving. She was completely attuned to the aircraft. David guided her through managing the flaps for turbulence. "Extend them gradually. Keep an eye on airspeed and vertical speed," he instructed. Emma followed meticulously, adjusting small increments and monitoring the instruments closely. The plane responded perfectly, shuddering but regaining stability after each gust. Outside, lightning continued to illuminate the storm clouds, turning them into jagged, flickering silhouettes. Inside, the cabin had grown tense but quiet, passengers realizing that the chaos outside had been partially tamed by the young girl at the controls. The plane rocked suddenly, more violently than before. Emma's heart raced, but she didn't hesitate. She corrected the roll, nudged the throttle, trimmed the plane's nose, and stabilized it. David whispered, "Good, keep it steady. Monitor fuel, altitude, and speed." Emma scanned all gauges, noting minor fluctuations, and made immediate corrections. One wrong move could have catastrophic consequences, but her actions were precise, her instincts impeccable. The plane, a massive metal bird in a storm, responded perfectly to her every input. Passengers began to whisper, all replacing panic. The storm wasn't finished. Hail began pelting the windows, rattling the fuselage. Lightning cracked close enough to illuminate the interior with a strobe-like intensity. Emma's small hands moved quickly across the controls, maintaining course and keeping the aircraft level. "We're approaching 20,000 feet, David murmured. "You're doing beautifully, Emma, but stay focused. The landing will be even trickier." Emma swallowed, adjusting her hands, checking instruments, and making tiny corrections to compensate for the sudden changes in wind speed and air pressure. Her focus never wavered. Her determination had become ironclad. Air traffic control crackled urgently. "Flight 482, confirm flaps and landing gear status. You are clear for approach, but maintain speed and altitude." Emma repeated the commands aloud. "Flaps 30, landing gear not yet deployed. Maintaining heading 270 airspeed stable," she said, keeping her voice calm and professional. David guided her through the next steps, ensuring she adjusted trim for descent, throttle for speed, and minor corrections for wind shear. Outside, the storm roared, tossing the plane, but Emma's precise movements kept Flight 482 on course. Every second counted, and she was not about to fail. The fuel gauge flickered again. A subtle imbalance, but enough to require immediate attention. "Switch tanks, adjust throttle, monitor engines," David instructed. Emma did so smoothly, watching the engine indicators closely. The engine stabilized. She exhaled silently, refusing to show panic. One passenger whispered, "How is she doing this?" A flight attendant shook her head, astonished. Outside, rain lashed against the windows, visibility dropped, and wind gusts forced the plane to tilt slightly. Emma nudged the yoke, corrected trim, and stabilized the aircraft once more. The cabin was tense, but hope had replaced despair. Minutes felt like hours. Emma monitored altitude, airspeed, heading, and fuel. David occasionally guided her through minor corrections, but the majority of the control rested entirely in her hands. The plane had stabilized, yet the storm and turbulence continued to challenge her at every turn. She adjusted throttle and trim, monitored engines, extended flaps for turbulence, and ensured the plane responded to every movement with precision. Outside, flashes of lightning illuminated farmland below, creating a surreal contrast between chaos above and calm below. Inside, Emma had become the center of a miracle in motion. David leaned over, whispering, "Prepare for final approach. You've got this. We'll land safely." Emma nodded, eyes scanning instruments, hands on yoke. Her mind calculated speed, heading, altitude, and wind. She adjusted flaps, throttle, and trim, preparing the plane for the delicate maneuver of descent. The passengers, sensing the plane's stability, began murmuring, whispers of relief spreading like wildfire. Flight attendants braced but began to regain calm, realizing the child pilot had performed a feat no one thought possible. Emma's small hands guided Flight 482 steadily, maintaining altitude and speed with absolute precision. Despite her exhaustion, Emma's focus never wavered. She understood the enormity of what she had accomplished, yet she refused to be distracted. Every flick of the yoke, every adjustment of throttle, every minor correction of trim was executed flawlessly. The plane remained stable, engines humming steadily, flaps extended, and heading perfectly maintained. David whispered again, "Next, we line up with the runway. Keep control, watch instruments, maintain composure." Emma swallowed, adjusting the yoke and throttle, eyes glued to the artificial horizon. Outside, the storm continued, but inside the cockpit, a quiet determination ruled. Emma had done the impossible. She had stabilized a commercial jet in a storm, managed fuel imbalance, controlled flaps and trim, and maintained precise altitude and speed. Passengers whispered, some crying quietly in disbelief and gratitude. Flight attendants exchanged glances, awed. David's heart swelled with pride, but he knew the most critical part: the landing was still ahead. The plane was steady, but one wrong move now could undo everything. Emma's determination was absolute. Her focus was unwavering, and she knew that she would see this through, guiding Flight 482 safely toward the runway that awaited beyond the storm. The distant glow of runway lights pierced the thick veil of storm clouds, a fragile beacon promising safety. Emma's small hands gripped the yoke with unwavering determination. Flight 482 was alive beneath her, responding to every adjustment, every subtle movement, every precise command. The plane hummed steadily, engines roaring against the wind, flaps fully extended for the descent. Turbulence still rattled the fuselage, but Emma's focus never wavered. She was no longer an 11-year-old girl. She was the pilot of a commercial jet, responsible for every life aboard, every heartbeat echoing in her mind. David leaned over, guiding her subtly. "Line up with the runway. Adjust heading to 275. Watch your airspeed carefully. Prepare for final approach." Emma nodded, her eyes scanning the instruments, fingers adjusting throttle and trim. Outside, lightning lit up the storm in jagged flashes, illuminating the wings and the trembling clouds. Passengers whispered prayers, some staring at the cockpit in disbelief, realizing a child was guiding them safely toward the ground. Flight attendants braced themselves, but tension had shifted to cautious hope. Every movement Emma made was deliberate, precise, and vital. Air traffic control's voice crackled urgently. "Flight 482, you are clear for landing. Maintain heading, reduce speed to 240 knots, descend to 5,000 feet. Confirm flaps and landing gear." Emma repeated the instructions aloud, her voice calm, almost eerily so given the circumstances. She carefully adjusted the throttle, monitoring airspeed, and eased the plane downward. The flaps responded, creating the necessary drag to slow the aircraft for approach. She monitored instruments meticulously, scanning altitude, vertical speed, and heading while compensating for gusting winds. Each adjustment was critical. The storm outside seemed relentless, but Emma's steady hands controlled the chaos inside. Passengers gripped armrests and seats, whispering anxiously. Some clutched loved ones, wide-eyed and silent. One mother held her child, murmuring, "It's okay, sweetheart, she's doing her best." The boy glanced toward the cockpit window, unable to comprehend the scene unfolding above. Flight attendants moved through the aisles, offering reassurances where they could. Even the most seasoned crew members were astonished, realizing the young girl guiding Flight 482 was performing flawlessly under circumstances that would unnerve any experienced pilot. Emma's calm determination had become a stabilizing force, radiating outward to every corner of the plane. David whispered guidance: "Check instruments, trim for descent, maintain heading, keep the nose level, watch the vertical speed indicator." Emma complied instantly, adjusting the yoke, throttle, and trim in subtle, precise increments. The plane dipped slightly in a gust of wind, but she corrected with skillful hands. "Good," David murmured, his pride mingled with anxiety. "We're in control. Now line up with the runway and prepare for landing." Emma focused entirely on aligning the plane, scanning the lights below, translating the instructions into flawless action. Each second felt eternal, each movement life-saving. As Flight 482 descended further, the runway lights became clearer, cutting through the storm like a lifeline. The engines roared as the plane fought the gusts of wind and rain. Lightning streaked above and below, illuminating the trembling wings. Emma's small hands on the yoke became the focal point of hope and survival. She adjusted throttle and trim meticulously, maintaining airspeed at 240 knots, flaps extended fully for landing, and heading aligned perfectly with the runway. David's voice remained calm but tense. "Steady, steady, we've got this," he said. Emma nodded, eyes fixed, determination unyielding. The plane began its final approach. Rain lashed the windows, visibility was poor, and wind gusts threatened to push the plane off course. "Adjust for crosswind," David whispered. Emma countered with precise rudder input, correcting the tilt caused by gusts. The vertical speed indicator showed a smooth descent, altitude decreasing steadily. She monitored airspeed, ensuring it didn't drop too low while maintaining alignment with the runway lights. Every motion was delicate, calculated, and executed flawlessly. The passengers remained tense but quiet, sensing the remarkable calm emanating from the cockpit. The landing gear needed confirmation. Emma checked the indicators. "Gear down," she announced, toggling the switch and confirming the position. Flaps were full, airspeed stable, heading perfectly aligned. Outside, lightning illuminated the runway intermittently. The plane shuddered slightly as wind buffeted the wings, but Emma compensated immediately, maintaining a steady descent. David whispered, "Perfect, steady. You've got this." The realization began to sink in for passengers. They were moments away from safety, guided by an 11-year-old girl who had mastered the impossible. Air traffic control continued to issue instructions. Reduce speed to 220 knots. Maintain heading 275. You are on glide path. Prepare for touchdown. Emma adjusted throttle, trim, and yoke accordingly. The plane responded beautifully, wings flexing against the turbulent gusts. The runway lights drew closer. Emma's focus intensified. There was no room for error. The storm was relentless, but she remained undistracted, her every action precise, deliberate, and life-saving. The cockpit became a zone of calm amid chaos. Passengers whispered, some praying, others holding their children tightly. Flight attendants braced themselves, but confidence had begun to replace fear. David leaned close, his voice calm but filled with pride. "Emma, slow descent, maintain alignment, flare slightly at touchdown." She followed precisely. The runway approached, stretching out beneath the wings through the storm, a line between peril and safety. Emma adjusted throttle, trim, and yoke as she prepared for the delicate moment of touchdown. The plane shuddered slightly, then leveled perfectly, ready to meet the ground. As Flight 482 drew closer, Emma's mind sharpened even further. She had maintained control through turbulence, storm, and fuel adjustments, but landing would require absolute precision. The vertical speed indicator showed a smooth approach. Engines responded perfectly to throttle adjustments, and heading remained aligned. The runway lights flickered through the rain, a lifeline in the storm. Every passenger held their breath, some praying silently. Emma's calm hands guided the plane, each adjustment deliberate, each movement a testament to skill beyond her years. The plane was ready for touchdown. The runway stretched below like a lifeline, its lights cutting through the stormy darkness. Emma's small hands gripped the yoke firmly, her eyes locked on the instruments and the distant strip of tarmac. Flight 482 shuddered slightly as a gust of wind hit the left wing, but she responded instantly, nudging the rudder and trimming the plane to maintain perfect alignment. The vertical speed indicator showed a controlled descent, the flaps fully deployed, and the engines humming steadily. Every motion mattered. One miscalculation could send the plane careening into disaster. David leaned over her shoulder, voice calm but urgent. "Steady, Emma. Keep her level. Reduce speed gradually. Flare slightly before touchdown." Emma nodded, repeating each instruction aloud, translating it into action with meticulous precision. Outside, the storm roared, rain lashing the fuselage and reducing visibility. Lightning flashed intermittently, casting eerie shadows across the runway and illuminating the tense faces of passengers gripping armrests. Flight attendants braced themselves, whispers of hope mixed with fear echoing through the cabin. Every person aboard relied on her skill, courage, and focus. The plane descended steadily, wings flexing against turbulent gusts, engines responding to subtle throttle adjustments. Emma maintained a smooth glide path, monitoring airspeed, altitude, and alignment. "We're almost there," David whispered, his voice a mix of pride and nervous anticipation. He had guided her through every challenge, but this moment, the landing, would be the ultimate test. Emma's focus intensified, her mind sharp as a razor. She had practiced this scenario countless times in simulators, but now the stakes were infinitely higher, the consequences real. Air traffic control crackled in her ear, providing last-minute guidance. Flight 482, you are on final approach. Confirm airspeed and landing gear position. Wind is variable, adjust as needed. Prepare to flare for touchdown. Emma repeated each instruction, eyes scanning instruments. The gear was down, flaps full, speed stable. She adjusted throttle minutely, keeping airspeed just above stall. The plane responded flawlessly, obedient to her careful commands. Outside, the storm raged, rain bouncing off the wings, but inside, a strange calm prevailed in the cockpit. Emma had become the pilot Flight 482 desperately needed. The runway grew larger in her vision, lines converging as the plane descended. A sudden gust pushed the right wing downward. Emma reacted instantly, nudging the yoke and adjusting trim to correct the roll. The plane shuddered but leveled perfectly. David whispered, "Perfect, Emma, keep her steady." She responded with small, precise movements, keeping the nose slightly elevated, preparing for the flare. The artificial horizon and altimeter guided her, every instrument a lifeline. Outside, flashes of lightning illuminated the storm, but she remained unshaken, translating focus into action with flawless precision. The moment of flare approached. Emma eased back slightly on the yoke, raising the nose gently to reduce descent rate. The wheels hovered above the runway, rain spraying across the fuselage. She monitored airspeed, throttle, and vertical speed, keeping Flight 482 aligned and level. The engines roared, responding to her subtle adjustments. David leaned close, whispering, "Steady, steady, you've got this." The plane trembled as it descended, every passenger holding their breath. The roar of the storm outside was matched by the collective heartbeat of everyone aboard. Touchdown. The wheels kissed the wet tarmac with a jolt, but the plane remained perfectly aligned. Emma applied gentle pressure to the brakes, balancing throttle and rudder to maintain direction on the runway. Rain sprayed wildly across the windows, and the plane shuddered as friction slowed it down. Outside, lightning illuminated the runway intermittently, but inside, a wave of tense relief began to wash over passengers. Flight attendants braced but smiled, realizing the impossible had been accomplished. The plane rolled steadily, controlled by the hands of an 11-year-old girl. "Brake gradually," David whispered. Emma complied, carefully balancing the throttle and rudder. The plane slowed, wheels gripping the wet runway. Turbulence still buffeted the fuselage slightly, but she countered every movement with precise corrections. The runway stretched behind them as they rolled toward a safe stop. Passengers began to murmur in disbelief, some whispering prayers of gratitude, others holding hands in silent awe. Flight attendants steadied themselves, realizing that the miracle unfolding was nothing short of extraordinary. Finally, Flight 482 came to a full stop. Emma kept the nose steady, throttled down the engines, and released the brakes. A stunned silence filled the cabin for a moment, followed by a wave of applause. Passengers cheered, some crying openly, realizing that the impossible had been achieved. A child had safely landed a commercial jet during a storm, saving hundreds of lives. Emma's small hands shook slightly as she released the yoke, her face pale but triumphant. David embraced her, whispering, "You did it. You really did it." Emma's mother pressed her hands to her daughter's cheeks, tears streaming down her face. "My brave girl," she whispered. Flight attendants and passengers alike offered congratulations, some shaking their heads in disbelief. The plane, battered by the storm but intact, rested safely on the tarmac. Emma's eyes scanned the instruments one last time, ensuring everything was stable. She had maintained control through turbulence, storm, fuel adjustments, and now the most critical moment, landing. She had succeeded beyond anyone's imagination. Outside, emergency crews prepared to meet the plane, unaware of the details but relieved to see Flight 482 safely on the ground. Lightning flashed one last time, illuminating the runway as if marking Emma's achievement in the sky. She leaned back slightly, exhausted but proud. David squeezed her shoulder, pride radiating from every word. You kept your focus, your calm, and your courage. You saved everyone on this plane. Emma's mind replayed the sequence. The instruments, the yoke, the throttle, the landing gear, every decision she had made. Each one had mattered. Each one had saved lives. For passengers, crew, and Emma's family, the reality of what had happened began to sink in. A child had become the unlikely hero of the skis, turning a potentially catastrophic flight into a story of courage, precision, and determination. Emma sat quietly, absorbing the applause and congratulations, her small hands trembling slightly from the adrenaline. Outside, the storm had begun to subside, leaving Flight 482 intact and every life aboard safe. The 11-year-old girl who had stepped into the cockpit had faced the impossible and emerged victorious. The roar of applause echoed through the cabin as passengers realized what had just occurred. Flight 482, battered by storm and turbulence, had landed safely. Hearts pounded, some tears flowed, and a stunned silence gave way to whispered congratulations. Flight attendants moved quickly, helping passengers unbuckle, reassuring them, and managing the sudden surge of emotion. Every face reflected astonishment and relief. Yet in the middle of it all sat Emma, 11 years old, small and pale, her hands still trembling slightly, eyes wide with the enormity of what she had just achieved. David and Emma's mother embraced her tightly, tears streaming freely. "You did it, Emma," David whispered, his voice thick with pride. "You saved everyone. You're amazing." Emma's mother cupped her daughter's face, murmuring, "My brave girl, you're a hero." Emma nodded, still processing the magnitude of her actions. Hundreds of lives depended on her skill, focus, and courage. A child had commanded the controls of a commercial jet during a life-threatening emergency and succeeded. Outside the plane, emergency crews approached cautiously, unaware of the miraculous story they were about to witness. The passengers slowly began to emerge from their seats, murmuring and exchanging stories of awe. A woman hugged a young child tightly, whispering, "We're safe because of her." A man wiped tears from his eyes, shaking his head. "I can't believe it, an 11-year-old." Crew members, initially tense and fearful, now looked at Emma with stunned admiration. She had not only stabilized the aircraft but had executed a near-perfect landing under conditions that would challenge even the most experienced pilots. Emma's courage, knowledge, and calm had turned disaster into triumph. News crews swarmed the tarmac within the hour, drawn by reports of the miraculous landing. Cameras captured the small girl stepping out of the plane, still clutching her mother's hand, wide-eyed but composed. Journalists jostled for position, microphones thrust forward. "Young girl lands plane during storm. Tell us, how did you do it?" Emma's father stepped in front, guiding her gently. "She trained for emergencies," he explained. And when the moment came, she stayed calm, focused, and applied everything she knew. "She's a hero." Emma's shy smile broke through her exhaustion, her quiet confidence now shared with the world. Airline officials arrived, faces a mix of disbelief and admiration. The captain and first officer, now recovering, were rushed to the hospital for observation. They insisted on meeting Emma. "I don't know what to say," the captain stammered. "You saved our plane, our passengers, everyone. You're incredible." Emma simply nodded, still processing. Her training had been rigorous, but no simulation could have captured the emotional weight of thousands of eyes and hundreds of lives depending on her. The airline promised awards, recognition, and an official commendation for bravery. Yet Emma's reward was the quiet pride she felt inside. Social media erupted. Videos of the landing, interviews with passengers, and news reports went viral within hours. Headlines screamed, "11-year-old hero lands plane during storm. Child pilot saves 150 lives. Miracle in the skis." Messages of admiration poured in from across the nation. Former pilots, engineers, and aviation experts praised her skill and composure, analyzing her every decision during the flight. Across the country, children and adults alike were inspired by the story of a girl who had faced fear, chaos, and responsibility, and had triumphed against impossible odds. Emma returned home days later to a quiet yet celebratory welcome. Neighbors, friends, and family gathered, cheering and applauding. Local news interviewed her, capturing the story of bravery and calm determination. Emma's teachers, classmates, and community members marveled at her composure and skill. "You were amazing," her principal exclaimed. "A true hero." Emma's response was humble. "I just did what I had to do," she said quietly, but everyone knew it was far more than that. She had gone beyond knowledge, training, and instinct. She had displayed courage that transcended her years. The airline officially honored Emma with a ceremonial award, naming her an honorary pilot and recognizing her as a model of bravery and composure. The ceremony was broadcast nationally. Emma stood beside her parents, small and nervous, yet dignified. Passengers from Flight 482 attended, hugging her, shaking her hand, and expressing gratitude. "You saved my family," one woman whispered, tears in her eyes. "I'll never forget it." Emma's calm smile reflected both pride and humility, a rare combination in someone so young. She had done the impossible, yet her courage remained quiet, unassuming, and deeply human. Months later, Emma continued to inspire. Schools invited her to speak about focus, courage, and preparation. Aviation programs offered mentorship and advanced training, hoping to nurture the talent that had saved so many lives. Documentaries and articles recounted her story, emphasizing that heroism is not limited by age or size, but by heart, preparation, and courage under pressure. Emma's story became a symbol, reminding the world that sometimes the unlikeliest heroes rise when the world needs them most. In quiet moments, Emma reflected on the flight. She remembered the turbulence, the storm, the instruments, and the roar of engines. She remembered the weight of responsibility, the fear, and the focus required to guide Flight 482 to safety. And she remembered the faces of passengers, some crying, some staring in disbelief, all relying on her skill. She realized that courage is not the absence of fear, but the ability to act despite it. She had faced the unimaginable, and had succeeded, not because she was fearless, but because she refused to fail. Flight 482 became a legendary story in aviation history. Pilots, flight attendants, and passengers would recount the miracle for years to come. Emma, once an ordinary 11-year-old, became an extraordinary symbol of courage and determination. The storm had been fierce, the challenge immense, but her calm, skill, and bravery had turned a potential tragedy into a story of hope. And though the world celebrated her, for Emma, the true reward was knowing that she had saved lives, that she had made a difference when it mattered most, and that she had proven that courage and preparation can overcome the impossible.